Hey, so I'm just feeling really just happy to be here with you guys tonight and to be continuing this series on one of Jesus's best-known parables, I would dare say. So I want to just start by let's read this together. It's from the 15th chapter of Luke, and as always, I encourage you to either listen or to follow along from in your bulletin. But let's read the scripture together, beginning in the 11th verse. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you've never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" Would you pray with me? Oh God, open our hearts and our minds to the work of your Holy Spirit. Let this word come alive for each of us and give us the courage and the humility to let it shape us. To that end, God, I pray that you would speak through me, and if need be, speak in spite of me, so that your word alone would be heard. Amen. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons." Perhaps one of the perils of that catchy title that we normally hear this parable called, the prodigal son, is that it immediately focuses us on a particular character, the younger, the prodigal son. But if we miss the others for that focus, then we will in fact miss the fullness of Jesus' parable. We'll miss the story that Jesus actually told. And so tonight, I'm hoping that maybe we can right that balance a little bit, because we don't want to miss the story of the older brother, the other of these two sons. Which, of course, isn't to dismiss the younger brother, that prodigal son. Last week, we considered the ways that even his elaborate journey away from home to a distant country can be familiar to us. As he goes off with his inheritance, even though his father was very much alive, as he squanders it in dissolute living, following those tempting invitations of the distant land, the invitations to make it and prove it on his own, without help, without his father. And there, in that distant country, he finds himself deaf to the voice of his father. But at some point, when he was destitute and hungry and alone, maybe we would say when he had hit rock bottom, he remembered. Jesus describes it by saying he came to himself. He remembered that he was his father's son, knew that that wasn't something that he any longer deserved, but nonetheless knew it to be true. At least enough that he begins practicing his speech, which includes a plea insisting the guilt of his life over the last years means he should be punished, not welcomed back as a son, but as a hired hand. If only he could just go back home. Go back and be within the voice of his father who once called him beloved. And we remember that when his father sees him coming home, sees him from far off because his father was waiting for him, that his father runs to meet him with compassion. We remember that his father interrupts his speech that he has prepared, wanting nothing to do with punishment or belittling or marking off the long list of his wrongdoings, but wanted to celebrate his return. Wanted to celebrate that his son who was dead was alive again, was lost, and had been found. It is a beautiful story. It's just that it doesn't end there. See, there's this other brother, the older son, and we first meet him in the story as he is returning from the fields. He's returning from the work that he has been doing, and not just on that day. It's the work that he's been doing for the years that his younger brother has been gone, off and away, frittering away his inheritance. It's the work that was made all the harder because his brother left him and his father to go and chase his fantasies. And as he comes towards his home that night from that work, he begins to hear the unmistakable sounds of a party. And then, after finding out why there's a party, he's angry. In fact, I would say he is livid, and he refuses to even go in and join the party, refuses to participate, refuses to have anything to do with the festivities that are celebrating the return of his younger brother, and chooses instead to simply stand outside. And not only do we witness in this moment his anger, I'm going to dare suggest that many of us can even appreciate it. Maybe some of you even want to argue that he is in the right. I mean, look, this is the son who stayed. He didn't run away. He didn't belittle his father or his family. In the years that followed the start of our story, I imagine people have been lifting him up as the model son, the one who is making the family proud. And when his brother said that their father was dead to them, and then he took the money and he ran, this is the brother who stayed, who did his duty, who worked hard every day, fulfilling all of his obligations, and probably a whole lot of obligations that his brother was shirking while being off in that distant country. See, he's doing all the things a good son is supposed to do, and yet it's striking to me that the sounds of a party that his father is throwing then would make him angry, that he would find himself unable to even go in. You see, in this parable, the story of two sons and their father, both sons are lost. Both of them are in need of healing and forgiveness. And in other words, both sons need to come home. And even though the older son never left home in the same way that his brother did, he has nonetheless wandered away from his father. Because we see that instead of the joy and the freedom that his father's love was offering him to experience and to live into, instead he felt hurt and unhappy and angry. Consider especially the words that he speaks to his father. His father, who, remember, comes out to meet him too. His father, who comes out to plead with him to come in, invites him inside to the party. And instead, the older son plants his feet and he says, "Listen, for all these years, I have worked like a slave for you. I've never disobeyed any of your commands, so where's my party? Where's the celebration for what I've done?" But then this son of yours comes back, this so-called son who has devoured your property with prostitutes, and all of a sudden it's a drop everything, spare no expense party. In his anger, I think we can begin to see what it is that's just tearing him up inside. He stayed home. He didn't move away from his father's voice, but somehow, the way that he has been hearing his father's voice has changed. Somehow what he has heard is less of a loving father and more of a demanding master. The obedience and dutiful work that he's been doing for the years that his brother was gone have become a burden to him. The service he was doing, even if at one point it was done in love, was done in service for his father and his family, that had become slavery. His anger and his envy reveal to us the bondage that he is living in. The younger son was gone. The younger son was lost in a very obvious way. He left. He wasn't there. And this lustful excursion to a distant land, I mean, frankly, that's the classic story of selfish human failure. We've heard it retold 100 times in all sorts of stories of redemption. But the older son was lost too, just in a less obvious way, but in a way that's no less severe. See, he did the right things day in and day out, the dutiful, law-abiding, hard-working son, and all he did, he was obedient to the Father. And because of that, I would imagine he was admired, respected among his home and his community, appreciated for being the model son. Maybe people even considered him faultless. Maybe even he considered himself faultless, or at least, or maybe especially in comparison to his kid brother. But when he heard the party, when he was confronted by that celebration, by his father's unique love and awesome joy at the return of his younger brother, this bondage that he had been living in just erupts and boils over. In his anger and his envy, we begin to see the resentment that he is carrying. It reveals an overwhelming pride in what he has achieved in his status and his work. And because he believes he has earned something through them that his brother has not, we can see that he too has actually become deaf to the loving voice of his father. And again, to be fair, his resentment, where it comes from, it's not all that surprising to us, right? I mean, his reaction makes sense. It makes sense under the rules the world teaches us to live by, under a love that is conditional, under an expectation that the more we achieve and the more we have to give, then the more love we have earned. And Big Brother, he has earned that love, right? While this little brother has not. And in fact, has earned something, but it's something very, very different. And so we can sympathize with the older brother who simply wonders why he, the dutiful one, has to stand outside the party. Why has he never received what he was due? All these years, all this work, where is his party? Why isn't he being honored instead of his unkempt brother returned from his tour of debauchery? And I think the story of the older son, I know I wrote this, and this is what I was thinking as I was writing it, that the story of the older son is more difficult for us, or at least for me, to touch or to embrace, or even to learn from. Not because it's unfamiliar. In fact, I think for many of us, his story is closer to our own than maybe the prodigal brothers. I think it's harder for us to grab onto because it's so closely connected to a desire to be good and virtuous. Because when we're introduced to this older brother, all we see is the dutiful and model son right up to the point that we encounter him grumbling outside of a party. The older son has done everything in his power to do right for his family, for his father, to do right in the eyes of the world and its expectations. He has followed the law, worked hard. He's picked up the slack that his brother's absence created. And in the world's glorification of merit and of achievement, we should presume a proud father and a happy ending for this elder son, this decidedly unprodigal son. But here's the thing. His father isn't a worldly father. His father isn't bound by that lesser conditional version of love. His father is God. And when the efforts of the elder son become more about pride or avoiding sin than experiencing the love of his father, when he cares more about comparison with his brother than he does about joining a loving celebration, that's when something else takes over, something a little more akin to moralism. See, he's been doing all the right things, he's just been doing them for all the wrong reasons. And his seriousness or his fanaticism or whatever you want to call it, they have made him so uncomfortable, even in his own home, even around his own father, a father who loved all of his children, and then in that love forgave his frivolous youngest son, and with passion and celebration. As I think about these two sons, and about how easy it would be for us, let's be honest, how easy it would be for us to just dismiss the anger of the older son as understandable, maybe as even deserved. It makes me wonder, what is it that's more damaging? Lust or resentment? What is it that really festers in us that begins to really make enemies between brothers and sisters and our siblings all over the world? Because this deep anger that grew for years in the older brother's resentment is so powerful that he would rather his father left his own brother to tend the pigs than to throw him a party. And just as the father, in his love, did not force the younger son to stay, even knowing all the pain the departure would bring them both, the father will not force the older son to come to the party. That is a choice that both sons need to make. And interestingly, we don't know the choice he makes. We don't, in the story Jesus tells, experience his choice. There's a great deal of resolution for his brother, but Jesus leaves this question open to us, leaves us wondering if this dutiful son is willing to confess his own need for forgiveness, willing to confess that he isn't perfect, willing even to acknowledge that he is not better than his brother. Because that's what it comes down to, isn't it? A willingness to admit that we too are sinners, that we too are in desperate need of God's forgiving love and maybe a party. And that if we find ourselves outside of a party that God is throwing, it isn't because we weren't invited. I want to say we may not be here tonight, you may not be here tonight as an act of coming home destitute from a distant land, but know that we're not any better than those who are. And we all need God's love and forgiveness, no less than one another. At the start of this chapter of Luke's gospel, the Pharisees and the scribes witnessed Jesus teaching and eating with sinners and tax collectors. And you know they love it when he does that. And they grumbled and they mocked him, and they stood outside that party saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so in response, Jesus told this parable, forcing them to consider not only the joy that God has in the return of the prodigal son, but to challenge their and our response to God's love for sinners. This parable calls the Pharisees and the scribes not to judgment, but it calls them to come and join the party. It invites them to the same table, invites us all to the immeasurable joy of the Father. The choice to stand outside, to hold on tight to our pride, and stand fuming with the older brother, chatting back and forth about what's fair. That's our choice to make. And so in that sense, returning home from a lustful escapade, that sometimes even seems easier to me than it is to recognize and return home from resentment. To return home from an anger that we carry around with us that lives deep inside of us, and then especially because it grows out of our desire to be good and to be virtuous. And in part because it isn't something that others will see in us. Like the older son, some of us are living those lives and we're being told how well we're doing. It isn't even something that we will see in ourselves unless we are bold enough to hear this call to look for it. Because as the older brother shows us, what's happening on the outside is never the whole story, even when it's lots of good things. Remember the younger son. He's broke. He's begging for scraps. He's wishing he could eat as well as the pigs he has been hired to feed. He is far from home, far from the voice of his father. And all the while, his older brother is revered and admired, has succeeded in exactly the ways his kid brother has failed. But both are lost. Both need the Father's love. See, you can come to every single thing we do at Trinity. You can volunteer for every ministry in driving distance, and you can still be just as lost as someone who is in a distant land. Still find yourself fuming outside of the party that God is throwing. But know this, if that's where you are, the Father's love will find you there. God will come out to us, speak to us away from the party if that's where we've chosen to be. And God will say to us, even after we have exploded in envy and anger, that we are still and always the beloved children of God. God will remind us that we are always welcome, always loved. And if we can trust in that love, if we can come to live within that sense of gratitude for what that love does for us above all else, even above a sense of achievement or obedience, then we can begin to hear the sounds of the party being thrown for another, not as an affront, but as an invitation. If we can remember that because we believe nothing we have ever done will separate us from the love of God, we also have to believe that nothing we have done can ever earn that love. That's a humbling truth to swallow. But if we can come to embrace it, to come to know it as a gift, to live with gratitude for the amazing ways the Father loves, then we can begin to know what it is to be the beloved children of God. And even we can come home. Amen.